It started with a slap, a sharp, shocking crack that cut through the warm, greasy air of the all-night diner like a gunshot. It wasn't just the sound of a hand hitting a face. It was the sound of cruelty, of powerlessness, of a line being crossed that could never be uncrossed. And for the two young men in Letterman jackets who delivered it, it was the beginning of the worst night of their lives, though they were too arrogant, too puffed up on their own misplaced pride, to know it yet. Before we dive into this story of quiet strength and brutal justice, if you appreciate tales where the underdog gets their day, make sure you're subscribed. We tell stories like this every week, and you won't want to miss what happens next. The all-night diner was a relic, a bubble of chrome, red vinyl, and fluorescent light trapped in a forgotten corner of a small American town. It was a place for graveyard shift workers, for insomniacs, for truckers passing through on lonely highways. And tonight, it was the stage for a quiet, hard-working young woman named Sarah. She moved through the diner with a practiced, wary grace, her light blue uniform dress a stark contrast to the shadows pressing against the windows. She was 22, but her eyes, the color of a stormy sea, held a weight that made her seem older. She refilled coffee cups with a soft, "Thank you, hon," and wiped down counters with a quiet efficiency that spoke of long hours and little thanks. She was the kind of person who faded into the background, a portrait of gentle resilience that most people took for granted. And then there were Chad and Brett. They swaggered in just after 10 p.m., a blast of cold air and obnoxious laughter preceding them. Their high school Letterman jackets, emblazoned with a proud B for the Bulldogs, were a testament to a glory days that were, for them, rapidly receding into the past. They were college freshmen now, home for the weekend, but they still carried themselves like the kings of the high school hallways. They slammed into a corner booth, their voices too loud, their presence an intrusion. They were the storm cloud that had finally broken inside the diner's warm refuge. They immediately started in on Ray, the elderly, stoop-shouldered short order cook, yelling their complex, ridiculous food orders through the service window, laughing when he struggled to keep up. They made snide comments about a young couple trying to have a quiet conversation, causing the girl to blush and look down at her plate. But their main target, the one who offered the least resistance and therefore the most appeal, was Sarah. From the moment she approached their table, order pad in hand, they began. "Well, hello there, sweetheart," Chad, the larger of the two, drawled, his eyes roaming over her in a way that made her skin crawl. "You new around here. Don't think I've seen a pretty little thing like you slinging hash before." Sarah kept her gaze fixed on her pad. "What can I get for you, gentlemen?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Brett snickered. "Gentlemen. Hear that, Chad? She thinks we're gentlemen." Their order was a deliberate mess. A burger with everything, but hold the pickles, the onions, the mayo, and the bun, well done but not dry, fries extra crispy but not burnt. They changed their minds 3 times, just to watch her scribble and erase a small, cruel game for their amusement. She endured it. She brought their drinks, and Chad accidentally knocked his glass of ice water onto the floor, the shattering glass making her jump. "Whoops, clumsy me," he said with a smirk that held no apology. "You gonna clean that up, sweetheart?" Sarah didn't speak. She just knelt, gathering the sharp, wet shards with trembling hands, the cold water soaking into the knees of her uniform. The other patrons looked away, a collective shame hanging in the air. They were witnesses to an injustice, but fear, or perhaps apathy, kept them silent. Ray the cook glared from his window, his gnarled hands clenched into fists, but he was 70 years old and weighed 130 pounds soaking wet. There was nothing he could do. The real torment began when their food arrived. Chad took one bite of his deconstructed burger and spat it back onto the plate. "This is cold," he announced, his voice booming. And I said, "Well done. This is pink. You serving me garbage, sweetheart?" Sarah, her face pale, stammered, "I can have Ray make you another one." "You bet you will," Brett chimed in, shoving his plate forward. "And these fries are soggy. You think we pay good money to eat this slop?" Sarah reached for the plates, her movements slow and defeated. But as her fingers brushed Chad's plate, he grabbed her wrist. His grip was tight, his knuckles white. The diner fell silent. The only sound was the low hum of the neon sign outside and the frantic sizzle from the grill. "You know," Chad said, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper, "I don't think you're sorry at all. I think you're a lousy waitress with a lousy attitude. I think you need to learn some respect. Sarah tried to pull away, but his grip was like iron. Please, she whispered, her eyes pleading. Please let me go. Please, that did it. That single word of submission seemed to inflate Chad's ego to its breaking point. He released her wrist with a shove that sent her stumbling back. You heard the lady, he sneered to Brett. She said please, and then he stood up. The vinyl booth creaked in relief. He took a step toward Sarah, who was now backed against the counter, her hands raised defensively. The other patrons were frozen, a tableau of horror. This was no longer just harassment, this was a physical threat. And then, with a contemptuous smirk, Chad drew back his hand and slapped her across the face. The sound was unimaginably loud. It wasn't a playful tap, it was a full-force, open-handed blow that snapped her head to the side and sent a spray of saliva into the air. A bright red handprint bloomed on her cheek. Sarah let out a small, choked cry, more of shock than pain, her hands flying to her stinging face. Tears, hot and immediate, welled in her eyes. In that moment, she looked impossibly young and broken. The world in the diner seemed to stop. The coffee stopped brewing. The clock on the wall stopped ticking. Everyone was holding their breath, suspended in a moment of pure, unadulterated wrongness. Chad stood over her, chest puffed out, a conqueror. That's for your attitude, he hissed, and that is precisely when the bell above the diner door jingled. The sound was so ordinary, so out of place in the aftermath of the violence, that every single head in the diner turned toward it. The door swung open, letting in a gust of wind and rain, and a man stepped inside. He was tall and broad-shouldered, silhouetted against the stormy night. He moved with an unnerving stillness, a predator's economy of motion. He wasn't just walking, he was occupying space, his presence immediately recalibrating the gravity in the room. He wore digital desert camouflage fatigues, the fabric dusty and worn, and a large, military-issue duffel bag was slung over his shoulder. His hair was cropped short, his jaw was set like granite, and his eyes, a pale, icy blue, scanned the room in a single sweeping, analytical glance that missed nothing. He took in the scene with the speed of a supercomputer, the terrified patrons, the smug bullies standing over a cowering figure, and then his gaze landed on Sarah, still holding her face, tears streaming down her reddened cheek. And in that instant, the stone-faced mask of the soldier cracked. A flicker of something raw and dangerous passed through his eyes, a storm of recognition, protectiveness, and a cold, focused rage. Behind him, a large German shepherd, its coat wet and dark, padded silently into the diner. The dog sat immediately at his heel, its intelligent eyes also fixed on the scene, a low, guttural growl rumbling in its chest that was more felt than heard. Chad and Brett, their bravado momentarily punctured by the sudden entrance, recovered quickly. This was just one guy. A soldier, sure, but still just one guy. What's your problem, man? Brett said, trying to sound tough but a nervous tremor betraying him. This is a private conversation. The soldier didn't even look at them. His eyes were locked on Sarah. He dropped his duffel bag to the floor with a heavy, final thud. The sound was a full stop, a period at the end of their reign of terror. Sarah, through her tears, looked up. Her eyes widened in disbelief, then flooded with a mixture of relief, shame, and a lifetime of shared memory. Her voice, when it came, was a broken whisper that carried through the silent diner. Alex, her older brother, the boy who had taught her how to ride a bike, who had scared away her high school bullies, who had held her at their father's funeral, the man who had left this small town to become something more, something sharper and deadlier. A Navy SEAL, home on leave. He had texted her from the road, saying he was going to surprise her at work. He had no idea the surprise would be mutual. Alex took a step forward, his combat boots making no sound on the linoleum floor. He finally turned his gaze from his sister to the two young men who had hurt her. There was no yelling, no bluster. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet, flat, and colder than the winter wind outside. It was a voice that promised violence, not threatened it. Did you? He asked, each word dropping like a stone. Put your hands on my sister. The air left the room. Chad, trying to reclaim his lost dominance, puffed out his chest. Look, pal, she was being a disrespectful little. He never finished the sentence. In a movement too fast to properly register, Alex closed the distance between them. He didn't run, he flowed. One moment he was 10 feet away, the next he was inside Chad's personal space. He didn't throw a wild punch. His left hand shot out not as a fist, but as an open-handed, stiff-fingered strike to the side of Chad's neck, just above the collarbone. It was a precise, debilitating blow, a technique designed to shock the nervous system and disable an opponent instantly. Chad's eyes bulged. He made a choked, gurgling sound, his hands flying to his throat as he stumbled back, gasping for air that wouldn't come. He collapsed to his knees, his face turning a frightening shade of purple. Brett stared in horror for a split second, then his fight, or flight instinct, fueled by panic and stupidity, chose fight. He let out a yell and lunged, swinging a wild, telegraphed haymaker toward Alex's head. It was like watching a toddler attack a grizzly bear. Alex didn't block the punch. He deflected it with a casual, almost bored motion of his forearm, redirecting Brett's momentum effortlessly. As Brett stumbled forward off balance, Alex's right hand clamped onto the back of his neck with a grip that felt like industrial steel. At the same time, his left hand seized Brett's punching arm. In one smooth, brutal motion, he used Brett's own forward momentum to slam him face, first down onto the Formica tabletop. The impact was sickening. The sound of Brett's nose breaking was a wet, crunching pop. The table, bolted to the floor, shuddered violently. Silverware and ketchup bottles jumped and clattered. Brett lay sprawled across the table, dazed and moaning, a bright crimson stain spreading from his face onto the white Formica. The entire confrontation had lasted less than 5 seconds. Two bullies, who moments ago had felt like the most powerful men in the world, were now broken and whimpering on the floor. Alex stood between them, his chest barely rising and falling. He looked down at Chad, who was still wheezing on his knees, and then at Brett, bleeding all over the table. There was no triumph in his eyes, only a cold, professional assessment, a job done. He turned away from them, as if they were already forgotten, and walked to his sister. Sarah was still trembling, her hands over her mouth. The raw, red mark on her cheek stood out in stark relief against her pale skin. Alex's demeanor transformed. The stone-faced operator was gone, replaced by a concerned, gentle big brother. He reached out, his large, calloused hands surprisingly tender, and cupped her face, his thumb gently brushing the edge of the welt. "Hey, Squeak," he whispered, using a childhood nickname she hadn't heard in years. "I'm here. You're okay?" At that, the dam broke. Sarah collapsed into his arms, sobbing into the rough fabric of his uniform, her whole body shaking with the release of terror and humiliation. He held her tightly, a solid rock in her shattered world. The German shepherd, sensing the shift, patted over and nuzzled her hand with its wet nose, a soft whine in its throat. It was then that the sound of sirens pierced the night, growing rapidly closer. Ray the cook, from his vantage point at the grill, had called the police the second Chad had grabbed Sarah's wrist. Red and blue lights strobed through the rain-streaked windows, painting the diner in pulses of emergency. 2 police officers, one older and seasoned, one young and eager, entered the diner, hands on their holsters. They took in the scene the 2 battered jocks, the stone-faced soldier holding the crying waitress, the terrified but now relieved-looking patrons. "All right, what's going on here?" The older officer, Sergeant Miller, asked, his voice firm but calm. Chad, finally finding a sliver of air, pointed a shaking finger at Alex. "He attacked us!" He wheezed, his voice a ragged scrape. "For no reason. He's crazy." Brett, lifting his bloody face from the table, mumbled in agreement through his broken nose. Sergeant Miller's eyes narrowed. He knew Chad and Brett. He'd had a few run-ins with them before for minor stuff, public drunkenness, noise complaints. He turned to Alex. "Son, you want to tell me your side of it?" Before Alex could speak, a chorus of voices erupted from the other booths. "It's not true," the young couple said in unison. "Those 2 were harassing Sarah all night." The trucker in the corner boomed. "He slapped her," an elderly woman added, her voice shaking with indignation. "He slapped that sweet girl right across the face." "That soldier, he was just protecting his sister." Ray the cook leaned through the service window, his face flushed with anger. "They assaulted my waitress, officer. I saw the whole thing. That young man there," he said, pointing at Alex, "just ended what they started." Sergeant Miller listened, his expression growing grimmer with each account. He walked over to Sarah. "Sarah, is that true? Did Chad here strike you?" Sarah, still clinging to her brother, nodded, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "Yes," she whispered. Alex, his arm still around his sister, slowly reached into a pocket on his fatigues. He didn't pull out a weapon. He pulled out a small leather wallet and handed it to the sergeant. It wasn't a driver's license. Sergeant Miller opened it. Inside was a military ID, but it was the emblem and the designation that made his eyes widen almost imperceptibly. United States Navy SEAL Team. This wasn't just a soldier. This was one of the most highly trained, lethally effective warriors on the planet. He had just taken apart two college jocks with the ease of a man swatting flies. It suddenly made perfect, terrifying sense. The sergeant handed the ID back to Alex with a slow, respectful nod. He then turned to his partner. "Cuff them," he said, jerking his head toward Chad and Brett. The younger officer looked surprised. "Sir, they're the ones who are hurt. They're the perpetrators of an assault," Miller said firmly. And from the sound of it, they got exactly what they had coming. Read them their rights. As the officers hauled a protesting, bleeding Brett to his feet and pulled a still gasping Chad up from his knees, Sergeant Miller turned back to Alex. "You'll need to come down to the station to give a statement. But given the circumstances and the number of witnesses, I don't foresee any charges being filed against you. This looks like a clear-cut case of defense of others." Alex simply nodded. His focus was entirely on his sister. He guided her to a booth, sat her down, and fetched her a glass of water with a steady hand. The other patrons, emboldened now, came over to offer their support to Sarah, their voices a low, comforting murmur. They had been silent when she needed them, and now their gratitude to her brother was mixed with a collective sense of guilt. The police led Chad and Brett out into the rain, stuffing them into the back of the squad car. Their Letterman jackets, symbols of their faded glory, were now stained with blood and rainwater. The B on their chests no longer stood for bulldogs, it stood for broken. Later, after the statements had been given and the diner had begun to empty, Alex helped Sarah into his truck. The German shepherd, a loyal sentinel named Zeus, sat in the back. The rain had softened to a gentle drizzle. Sarah was quiet, staring out the window at the passing streetlights. "I'm sorry you had to see that squeak," Alex said, his voice soft. "I'm sorry I wasn't here sooner." Sarah shook her head, a small, sad smile touching her lips. "Don't be," she said. "You were right on time." She looked at him, really looked at him, seeing not just her brother, but the man he had become. The man who moved with the stillness of a deep ocean and the swift, final force of a tidal wave. "They had no idea," she whispered. Alex kept his eyes on the road, the ghost of a smile on his own face. "They never do," he replied. The story of what happened at the all-night diner spread through the small town like wildfire. It became a modern-day folk tale, a parable about the dangers of mistaking kindness for weakness. Chad and Brett, once the town's golden boys, became pariahs. They were charged with assault and eventually accepted a plea deal that included community service and anger management classes. They never bothered anyone in that diner again. In fact, they rarely showed their faces in town at all. Sarah, empowered by the ordeal and her brother's unwavering support, found a new strength within herself. She didn't quit her job, but she did learn to stand taller, to speak louder. She knew now that she was never truly alone. And Alex, the quiet warrior, spent the rest of his leave with his sister, the two of them rebuilding the bond that distance and duty had stretched. He was a reminder that sometimes heroes don't wear capes. They wear combat boots and faded uniforms, and they appear in the most ordinary of places, like a rain-soaked diner at midnight, just in time to deliver a justice so swift and so absolute, it echoes long after the door has closed behind them. The world is full of quiet people, but you never know who is standing in their corner, ready to answer the call. It leaves us with just one question, a simple one, to all of you watching this story of an American town and a justice served. From which part of the country are you watching this video? Let us know in the comments below.